2,500 years ago, a Greek scribe wrote out a dazzling list of wonders. Sights seen in the mind's eye, he said, can never be destroyed. To this day, that magic list still haunts the modern world. Searching for a safe harbour. He's looking for Alexandria in Egypt, on a low and dangerous coast. The currents here are tricky. Sailors have swung the lead like that for thousands of years, sounding the rocks and looking to see if their line has river mud on it, to show they're close to shore. Before the modern city and its high-rises were built, you saw nothing on this low horizon till you almost hit the beach. Of all the seven wonders there, the most practical was the ancient lighthouse called the Pharos. It stood here. Built around 285 BC, it was one of the seven wonders of the world. You could see it for 30 miles out at sea, marking the ancient city and the port. A magic light that medieval legends said would burn the sails of attacking boats. The Pharos, though, did more than guide ancient shipping. It symbolized and celebrated one of humankind's most spectacular experiments, the birth of the modern city, the magic Metropolis. Once, the long low coast of Egypt held just a few small fishing villages, some rocks, some sandbanks and some basking seals. Then, Alexander the Great arrived. He was making an empire that was stretched from Egypt to Afghanistan.
Alexander loved cities. He liked founding cities. He founded 17 cities that he called Alexandria. He had a very interesting attitude about cities and architects. A young man came to see him once called Dinocrates. He said he had a great idea for a city. He said, I'll get a landscape and I'll carve it into the likeness of you, Alexander, and in the palm of this figure will be an entire city called Alexandria. Well, the idea was that the clouds would form around the statue's head and the water would run down the veins in the arm and feed the city. Alexander looked at the plan. I like this boy, he says. I like the way he thinks. But the city isn't going to work, because the true blood of a city is not water down the vein, but trade. So when Alexander founded a city, he thought about trade. Look, I'll show you what I mean. The first thing Alexander thought of was a big square marketplace, and he put it right on the beach, between the Nile and the sea. That's the coastline along there. And then he worked out the various quarters of the city, and he put a huge wall around the whole thing. Within 20 years, Alexander was dead, and the architects had moved on a bit. They put a causeway from the marketplace to a little island off the coast. They put a great crossroads in, And at the centre of the crossroads, they put Alexander's tomb. He died and was buried in his city. So the city really, which was full of wonders, walls, palaces, anything you can think of, had two special wonders, the lighthouse on the island and Alexander's own tomb. Think of what the man had made. He'd made a city after his own ideas. This was a city full of Egyptians, full of Greeks, full of Jews. It was a multicultural modern city, and it was full of wonders, full of temples and palaces. It was a new city for a new age.
The list of 7 wonders was made in this revolutionary new age. 2 of them, 2 urban wonders, the Pharos lighthouse and a king's tomb, a mausoleum by the sea, were subtle symbols of these cities' faith and trade, their anchor and advertisement. Ancient Alexandria, though, is buried now beneath a modern city. So there's not a lot to see of the ancient fizz and fury of Alexander's world. And what there is in the museum. I like local museums. They're full of real things, not antiques bought at auction. Just bits and pieces found when people were making their garage or putting in traffic lights. Just loose stones from buried cities. He's nice, isn't he? It's a very beautiful fragment of completely vanished Alexandria from the first great Greek period. It's made by a Greek. Even the stone comes from Greece. Everything went past the lighthouse. Marble, slaves, silk, jewellery, wheat from Egypt. This was the beginning of El Dorado. This is the finest work you can possibly get. Practically all vanished. Look at this. Ancient Alexandria, classic Alexandria in a yard and a half. Here's a Greek altar from somebody's house. Here's a Greek text on a bit of a statue base. And here is a native Egyptian, but all dressed up in his best Greek robes. The Alexandrians love to show off. And this is quite a rare Hebrew inscription from ancient Alexandria. The Jews were a very powerful group of Alexandria's citizens. The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, was actually translated into Greek here in the very shadow of the Pharos. So the Pharos lighthouse signalled far more than just a safe harbour. It fell down finally in the earthquake of 1375. These, perhaps, are some of its sea-washed stones. It stood on the very tip of the harbour wall. This splendid old medieval fortress, built by the Mameluke Sultan Qaitbay, stands on its foundations. The Pharos, though, was at least 5 times higher. At more than 300 feet, the tallest building of its time. Today, children come here on trips from school. And all around them, the medieval walls are studded with much more ancient stones.
There they are, look. Hieroglyphs of a pharaoh. 2,500 years after they stood on a great obelisk holding up the door of an Arab fort.
Right in the middle of the fortress, they built a mosque. Now the interesting thing about this mosque is that it isn't orientated like most are to Mecca. This stood on the foundations of the ancient lighthouse, and so it stands north, south, east and west, like the old lighthouse did. And if you look up, just for a while, up into its great tower, what you're looking at really is a ghost of the lighthouse. And can't you see in your mind's eye men and donkeys carrying fuel up to the light of the top? There is a place, though, where you can still see an ancient lighthouse, well preserved and standing to this day. 30 miles east of Alexandria, on the same low coastline, a miniature Pharos. Square, octagonal and round, with an inside staircase.
So this is what the real lighthouse in Alexandria looked like, just 10 times bigger than this one, with a few statues and an inscription. Certainly not like those wonderful things you see in children's books. Neither did it have a great lens on top. You often hear stories of how they had a magic lens which could focus the light and set enemy ships ablaze. Had none of that. It had a little fire up here, and that was probably only turned on when the fleet went by. Still, anything, even a tower, is good for these dangerous waters. But you know, this lighthouse wasn't just for ships. This little one here is above a tomb. It's part of a tomb complex, and this light was to guide the spirit of the dead that was wandering around Egypt back to his body again. And this just a little while after the great lighthouse was made. So as they started that lighthouse on the island of Pharos in Alexandria, those people were saying, look at our new city, how proud we are of it, of its wealth and riches and wisdom and learning. This lighthouse is going to give a new light in the ancient world.
So the great lighthouse, its lantern shielded with sheets of glass, became the symbol of the city. But all was not well inside the magic metropolis. With the city's dazzling mixture of faith and customs, many Alexandrians felt very lonely and uncertain. It was the birth of a peculiarly modern alienation. These are the unexcavated tombs of the ancient kings of Sardis, the capital of Lydia in western Turkey, where money was invented. Money was the fuel of Alexander's brand new cities. From the Seven Wonders to the stock exchange, a great part of the modern world started here, beside these bubbling fields. The city of Sardis stood at the end of a legendary trade route that ran east to Persia and the Silk Road, with merchants, mercenaries and kings like Croesus, whose legendary wealth came from the gold taken, it is said, from a little stream that ran down from the hills right through the city's ancient marketplace. Needless to say, Archaeologists have long been interested in Sardis.
They didn't find King Croesus' legendary marketplace, but what they did find were the very workshops in which the modern world was forged.
When modern archaeologists dig sites like this, they always sieve all the dirt they take away. And to their amazement, the archaeologists working here found little pearls of gold turning up in their sieves. What they'd found wasn't a marketplace. It was the very place, the smelting places of the gold from the little stream. What was going on here, you see, was in these little hollows. They were putting all the gold and the wood, and it was melting down, and they were taking out these big slabs of gold from the bottom. Now, this had been going on for thousands of years. That's not difficult. What happened next was revolutionary, because you could never control the purity of this gold. It had lead, it had silver, it had all sorts of things in it. But the people here, for the first time, made pure gold. They took this lovely golden substance, they beat it flat, they mixed it with salt, they put it in pots and they cooked it. When they took the gold from the pots, for the first time in human history, they made controllable, pure gold.
So, as usual, the very dust of ancient lives, tiny little relics of the past, suddenly become so important. You see, people lived and worked here about 600 BC, just when Croesus and a few other people were experimenting with the idea of money. Now, pure gold means that you can make money which is always the same. It's an eternal symbol. When the goddess Artemis Kybele was stamped on equal amounts of Croesus gold, people knew what they had in their hands. Within 50 years, there were banks, misers, merchants, marketplace, men who lived by buying and selling. This idea of a single abstract value that you can actually hold in your hand had come into the world for the first time.
Money, great sacks of money, had served to build many of Alexander's brand new cities, and several of the Seven Wonders too. As you might expect, when Alexander died in 323 BC, his empire quickly divided into smaller kingdoms, each of them ruled by his generals and his bankers. Each city was alone. The city's walls became the city's armour, became so large and so magnificent that some of them were counted as wonders in their own right. These tremendous walls, driving for miles across the mountains, protected the smallish city of Heraclea down by the lake. They were enormous monuments to a general ancient insecurity. The new man in his brave new world was quite afraid. Soft cities set in hard, sharp shells. Nowadays, though, the pain and energy that made these brutal stones seems to have seeped away, and we are left with pleasurable ruins. Alexander's cities, too, have mostly gone. In western Turkey, though, a few of them, like Heraclea, still remain, with all their ruined wonders, their temples and their statues. Half memories of wonder, the ancestor of every modern town. Priene, in western Turkey, is the best preserved of all the Hellenistic cities. Houses, marketplaces, temples, mausoleums, rare ruins, filled with the fears and hopes of the people of the magic Metropolis. Visit Priene today, and you can still taste the authentic flavour of the people of the age of the Seven Wonders. There's those great dark walls again, guarding the beginnings of the modern world. The people of the town thought that Alexander once slept in this house. After Alexander's death, you had to wear white to come into his house. You see, this isn't just Alexander the Great slept here like George Washington slept here or something. In those days, your heroes became gods. So Alexander's house became a shrine. And that's a great altar over there. They found portraits of him and marble offering tables and all the rest. But nonetheless, it is a genuine Hellenistic house from the time of the Seven Wonders period. Normal family dwelling with 2 stories, very high rooms, very small rooms, very dark, with small windows, not much sunlight coming through. Not a very homey place, in fact. But then in these great cities, home, the front parlour, was the middle of the town. And at the end of every street, just like London, the name. But this is the real treasure here. The treasure of all cities of that period. This is a fountain, you see? And the water came out here, ran down there and ran right down the street and into every house. Every citizen had to look after his own bit of the water supply system. Now the nice thing about the water here is that the whole system was constructed and paid for by a woman, the first woman mayor of the place, a lady called Feely. It's an unusual role for women in society at that time. In houses, for example, they were kept apart. But there was nothing actually to stop them entering public life, and quite often they did. Feely put in this wonderful aqueduct system, recorded it in an inscription. There's a lot of civic pride here. The oil of these cities was money. Money first functioned here in these ancient agora, the marketplaces of the ancient cities. The cities rented out all the shops along the side. They controlled the prices, they regulated quantities, they looked after the markets. What was for sale? Well, food, slaves and imported goods. And these great marble colonnades, well, this is where the ancient citizens, the free men, just strolled to sniff the breezes. These cities weren't really cities in the modern sense of the word. Nothing industrial was ever made here. There were rioters and artists and thinkers and people like that in very small numbers. And large numbers of people who just loafed around the place, big landowners with their slaves, some small farmers too, and perhaps a few small businessmen. But these really, well, they're more like recreation cities, like Palm Springs or Royal Tunbridge Wells. People had a good time here. They came down to the marketplace, these grand open spaces, and sat around on their chairs and talked about the price of wheat or whether the statue they just made was as good as one of the Seven Wonders. And if you were very rich and you subsidised the poor for grain, you might get your name on a stone or even a statue if you were mayor or something. It was a good life. It was one that lasted for nearly 1,000 years. This is the council chamber. Some 640 of Praini's wealthiest citizens came into this room to talk, and they talked about everything from the price of grain to hiring a city doctor. These little council chambers, their seats, their space, the very air in them, are the real ancestors of modern democracy. Democracy not in the sense of tribal societies, say, where everybody gets to say his piece, but democracy in the sense of a very carefully controlled and regulated society. And here,
in this mercantile climate, it produced a dynamic and aggressive society that is really the ancestor of the modern world. So, this space here, between these two rows of seats, this is a real revolution. If you go back to older societies than this one, you can walk down 1,000,000 dusty ancient lanes past ancient lives into shadowed temples, and the cities can be enormous, but you'll never find a space like this, with faces sitting opposite each other. Those ancient societies are instinctive. They move almost like shoals of fish. Here, though, men are looking, faces are seeing, they're watching, they're seeing the other points of view, they're balancing, they're judging things, they're making lists like the Seven Wonders. It truly is the ancestor of the modern world.
Life, then, was something of a race. And here's where the young men learned to compete in it. The city's own gymnasium and running track, with its ancient starting blocks. I suppose if you were really good, you got to go to the Olympic Games.
Nothing was too good for the young lions who came to rule the city in the next generations. These are the public baths, served by the aqueduct in marble tubs and marble taps. But always cold water. Why is it always cold water and short hair? Even Alexander was said to be sissy because he had long hair. But look at the facilities. Good non-slip floors. And of course, the athlete's foot bath. They all needed foot baths. So after they washed and scrubbed after their races, it was off to school. Next to the wash house, the schoolroom, with only 3 walls. Can you imagine what it was like in here in the winter? Pretty cold. This is male bonding land. But this, in the schoolroom, like many schoolrooms, is covered in the names of its pupils. The kids have scratched them out down this wall, so carefully, letter by letter. You know, the gift of writing Greek was really only given to these privileged people in these cities. Practically nobody else in the land wrote or could read, except a few women, and they seem to have learned at home. But this was really the centre, this was the voice that we have today of Greek society.
Right at the heart of every city, the mausoleums of the founders and the temples of the gods. There were 2 sorts of temple, one in light and marble, the other in darkness and dark stone. This is Prien's Temple of Athena, an exquisitely light building made by a great architect called Pythios, and just after he designed and built the first mausoleum, the king's tomb that was one of the 7 wonders of the world.
You know, the thing about Pythios' genius is not the fact that the guy designed a Greek temple with a pitched roof and lots of columns down the sides. People have been doing that for centuries. It's the care, it's the minuteness of the detail that's so clever. Look, he's just come from building the mausoleum, and he's gone back to that most classical, simple form of the temple. And this bit, for example, is 65 feet up in the air. And just look at it. It's correct in every tiny detail, like a printed circuit, but like the most beautiful printed circuit you ever saw. Genius is in the details. That's what this man is doing, an absolutely classical exercise in perfection. That's Athena's temple over there. I'm off to another one. No less important to the city, but not quite as beautiful. It's the sanctuary of Demeter, the mysterious god of fertility and death. Demeter's daughter, been kidnapped by the god of Hades.
Every year she went into the underworld, and every year she returned as the sprouting grain. Now look, don't get to think that these ancient Greek religions are just sort of fourth form essays in Greek and Roman myths. This is a real system you can live by. Think of an example. There's a beautiful epitaph on a gravestone that says two parents are writing to the guy who ferries dead people across to Hades. And they say, "Take care of our little boy. When he gets out of the boat, please help him because he can't walk very well and he's got new shoes on." Now, when people are thinking like that and getting consolation out of a system, this is a real system that works and gives them some sort of order for the world. There's not much left in Demeter's Hall of Mysteries now. It always was very plain and simple architecture, and the things that went on here were so mysterious, and we still don't have the faintest idea what they were. When the German excavators dug these passages out, they found extraordinary statuettes buried in them. Obscene figures they were, of a goddess called Balbo, whose face had been strangely mixed up with her genitals. Don't often see pictures of that in books, do you? In fact, it's the sort of thing that traditionally historians have always tend to neglect. So when you think of these cities, you don't really think much of eroticism or sexuality, yet in fact they were filled with it. There were phallic and epiphallic statues. There was an extraordinary erotic art going on, even in the smallest detail, and a marvellous erotic literature too. You see, these cities were really seen almost as living organisms, and the sexuality then was the city's sexuality. It was the power and potency of the state. It was, of course, a concept that the Christian city of God entirely rejected. The Christians also rejected the Greek idea of death. An underworld, a dark cold pit filled with the shades and spirits of the dead. And here we reach into the alien heart of the magic Metropolis. I am Mausolus, King of Caria. I was tall, handsome and victorious in war. I have lying over me in Bodrum a tomb such as no other dead man ever had, adorned with marbles of men and horses carved as if they were real, and in fine marble. King Mausolus is talking to us from the underworld, in the words of a Greek philosopher. Alexander would have seen King Mausolus' great tomb, the Mausoleum, as he besieged Halicarnassus, now Bodrum in southwestern Turkey, the tomb of the city's founder at the city's centre, a huge building decorated by the Greeks' most famous sculptors, and one of the 7 wonders of the world. In 352 BC, on the day they buried King Mausolus, they slaughtered a herd of sheep on these steps, and 5 oxen too, hamstrung, slaughtered and bled so the blood ran down here towards the greatest tomb the world had ever seen, one of the 7 wonders of the world. A tomb so great, it's given its name to all great tombs ever since as mausoleums. And this great stone was the plug that sealed the burial chamber. They used to say, ancient writers, that King Mausolus' tomb seemed to hang over his city in a silver cloud, but now it's completely floated away. And there's a mark here that gives us a clue as to where some of it had floated. See this? This puzzled classical philologists for years. In fact, most British people over 50 could tell you exactly what it was. It's the mark of the British War Department. The mausoleum was found by a British professor. It was excavated by a man from the British Museum and the British Navy and the British Army with the help of the British ambassador in Constantinople. They loaded
218 crates of marbles onto HMS Georgian. The man from the BM put it like this: "The hold is nearly full," he says. "We still have room for sculpture on the deck, but it might be necessary to load off the guns at Malta."
Not all the mausoleum had sailed off to London, though. Mausolus had left a vast amount of ancient stone behind him. Long before the archaeologists arrived, much of it had already ended up as the property of the Knights of Malta at their great Crusader castle in the bay, the Castle of St. John.
Right through the 15th century, the knights sucked the old city into their fortress. Every wall of it is made of ancient buildings. Look, this is how you can see some of these reused blocks have actually come from real Greek temples. That round thing there with this little scalloping edge, that's a slice of a column, like salami, and that's a pretty good analogy because this is an Italian knight there. See his coat of arms? And above it, to protect his coat of arms, 2 more bits of temple set into the wall. The top one was used by the knights to keep the weather off of the inscription. If you look under there, it tells you the name of the knight, a man called Angelo Muscatola. This is the Italian tower, and it was built in 1436. That's some 60 years before the knights started to take the mausoleum to bits. So for fragments of the mausoleum, you have to look somewhere else in the castle. It was a change in armaments technology, bigger and better cannons, that finally caused the mausoleum's destruction. It was taken down stone by stone. All these ramparts you see around me come from the mausoleum. They're designed so that the newfangled cannonballs would just bounce off them. These lovely big square stones I'm walking over are the core, the heart of the mausoleum. The great marble lintel over my head is a fragment of Pythios' marvellous architecture. And that white marble there, well, heaven knows what was on that before the military commander carved his name across it. Gatineau, 1513.
Since the Knights of Malta tore the mausoleum down, there's been no end of effort to put it back together. It's a great game. There's not much to go on. Just a confusing Roman text, the fragments of its architecture that were taken off to London, and the work of archaeologists. This recently excavated tomb by the village of Belevi, close to Halicarnassus, was probably made for a Syrian king. It looked much like the mausoleum, and was built about a century after it. Here you can see something of the mausoleum's real size. The detail is superb, though Pythios' mausoleum was probably even finer. This little tomb, in the nearby city of Milas, a tiny mausoleum, shows what the Romans meant when they said the great mausoleum seemed to float on air. That ceiling's really clever. Lots of stones all keyed together. One of Pythios' most original ideas. There are hundreds of reconstructions of this strange old building with its pyramid roof and rows of columns. From eminent architects to suicidal poets. Individual, inky mausolea. There are not only those paper reconstructions either. Fancying themselves as Mediterranean kings, several 19th century bankers and industrialists built mausoleums for themselves.
the 19th century architects who were really involved in historical style.
The mausoleum stood for a symbol of architectural excellence. It wasn't only tombs that model on the mausoleum either. Many are high-rises, but they don't hear much about that. After all, who wants to be told they're working in a tomb? Anyway, this mausoleum here, the most expensive single tomb in Highgate Cemetery, designed for a banker called Julius Beer.
That's Beer's little daughter there. She died quite young, and he got a sculptor, a very famous academic sculptor, to make that rather touching portrait of her going into the arms of death, just like King Mausolus employed sculptors for his mausoleum. Do you know, the architect, who's called John Scott, he's had a real good time in here, actually. He's taken bits and pieces of those various old restorations that were kicking around when he was designing the place, and he's added it to memories of his holidays, bits of Renaissance Italy and Byzantium and things like that. Now, you can see why people were so keen on copying the mausoleum. It was a very famous building. But what none of these copies tell you is why was the mausoleum famous in the first place? By Greek standards, it wasn't a very big building. Wasn't even very beautiful. It's a rather ugly shape for Greek buildings. So why on earth was it so famous? Well, for the answer to that, you really have to go back to the ancient texts. Remember that text of Mausolus? I am Mausolus, king of Caria. I have over me in my grave in Bodrum a tomb covered in fine sculpture of men and horses.
Amongst the fragments of the mausoleum sent off to London are pieces of the oldest Greek portrait sculptures in the world. See how powerful the image is. That's a real person, or at least an individual magnified, ennobled and enlarged. For the first time, men and women, not marble gods, were set amongst the shining marble columns. These sculptures told their visitors, this could be you. That's why the mausoleum was counted as one of the 7 wonders of the world. It set the citizens of the magic metropolis walking tall. Today, the real Alexander seems as elusive as the wind. Yet even the simplest stories of his life tell us something of his time, the age of the 7 wonders. One tale tells us that Alexander and some friends travelled from the shore of Egypt into the blank Sahara, searching for a famous oracle. They got lost here, the legend says, and nearly died of thirst. And the gods sent crows to them to show them the way down through the mountain of the moon, down into a hidden valley and the lake of the oasis of Siwa. And at its centre, amidst the waving palms, the temple of the oracle. Inside a small dark chamber roofed with palm logs, Egyptian priests told Alexander something that affected him until the day he died. No one now knows what it was, neither will we ever know. Whatever it was, though, it didn't stop Alexander from invading all the ancient East and leaving its cities as devastated, dusty shells. Sure, people still lived in them after Alexander's time, but they'd been changed forever. The brutal, self-confident Greeks had shown them another sort of city, a different way of being. Yet this story of the journey into Siwa shows Alexander himself desperately searching for the old securities. And that, perhaps, is what he really discovered at the Temple of the Oracle. That in the magic Metropolis, with all its fizz and fury, it's still impossible to live successfully without a past.